crawling through the streets of Los Angeles, feasting on piles of uncollected trash. Now, the I-Team exposed a problem recently, and the city vowed to clean it up. But we found evidence the city's rodent population is growing, pushing those rats and possibly disease closer to homes and businesses.
They didn't even wait for the full headline. They heard the headline Los Angeles releases thousands of rat-killing creatures, and the jokes flooded the internet. Only in LA.
Rats caught on camera scurrying through an Irvine neighborhood. People who live there say it's becoming unbearable.
Nature's hit squad. Memes stacked by the minute. But while the world laughed, the city kept twitching. A warehouse lost power again. A kitchen shut down at rush hour. A sleepless maintenance crew patched the same chewed wire for the third time in a week. The crisis wasn't in headlines, it was in habits. And the rats? They were never just pests. They were the symptom of a system unraveling. So Los Angeles made a choice few cities dare to. It stopped fighting harder and started thinking differently. But how will this turn out for them? Will this be the future of every city that's still losing the same quiet war? The problem, Los Angeles, stopped ignoring. Rats didn't descend on Los Angeles in a single wave. They accumulated, one quiet sign at a time. A scratch behind a wall, a streak of motion under a dumpster, a bin wired shut for the third week in a row, a piece of drywall endlessly patched. None of it dramatic enough to make news. All of it steady enough to become normal, erosion, not collapse. They learned the city with the precision of delivery drivers. Warm air leaking from restaurant kitchens meant food. Alley doors that never latched meant safety. Irrigation lines behind strip malls meant water, always. Forgotten crawl spaces and aging apartment walls gave them shelter. Wherever human habits formed a rhythm, rats slipped into the beat. When people finally said, "They're everywhere," it wasn't an exaggeration. It was an admission of routine failure. The city's tools barely dented the problem. Snap traps caught a few but changed nothing. Glue boards added cruelty without lowering numbers. Poisons killed in the moment, but spread long after into owls, hawks, neighborhood cats, and beloved pets. Every attempt shifted the harm without shrinking the cause. What made this infestation different was its reach. It touched schools, clinics, corner stores, warehouses, and homes where people couldn't simply move away. It wasn't an eyesore. It was a breach. A quiet one, but a breach all the same. Eventually, the city understood something uncomfortable. Rats weren't just filling empty spaces. They were exploiting human patterns, trash schedules, shortcuts, gaps in maintenance faster than policy could respond. Extermination had become an illusion. What the city needed wasn't more poison. It was pressure, predictable, natural, behavioral pressure that changed how rats moved, not just how many died. That's when biologists introduced an answer few people took seriously at first. Mustelids, small, quick, fiercely territorial hunters, shaped by the same pressures that shaped rats, but designed to oppose them. Animals that could slip through fist-sized gaps, track scent through pipes, and make a rat second-guess every route it thought it owned. These were the so-called rat-killing creatures, and they weren't dumped into the city. They were prepared for it, monitored, conditioned, kept wary of humans, raised in environments mimicking the urban maze they'd eventually patrol. A careful, deliberate reintroduction of a predator the system lacked. But animals alone couldn't fix a city. To make them effective, Los Angeles had to rebuild the very landscape rats once ruled. Building a city that could hunt without hating. Los Angeles is a city of freeways and billboards in the popular imagination. But up close, it is a labyrinth of service alleys, delivery bays, rooftop units, drainage channels, railway verges, and forgotten corners. The team behind the project looked at that labyrinth and saw something else, a network of potential corridors. They began by mapping temperature patterns, light levels at different hours, noise profiles, and waste flows. They identified where rats moved most boldly and where they slipped through almost unseen. Then they overlaid that with where mustelids could safely travel and den without colliding with people, pets, or traffic. The result was a plan that hid in plain sight. On the tops of certain warehouses, small green roof patches were installed that looked like aesthetic improvements, but also supported insects and small prey species, offering backup food sources. Along flood channels, vegetation was managed to provide sheltered movement instead of open, exposed concrete deserts. Utility easements were retrofitted with narrow conduits that allowed mustelids to travel alongside pipes instead of attempting dangerous routes across roadways. In commercial districts, some planters were designed with internal cavities, creating dry, secure pockets where the animals could rest between patrols. On certain structures, discrete entry points were added that large animals and humans could not use, but small predators and rodents could. The difference was that the predators now had the advantage. This was predator-supportive urban design, not spectacle. The city was not trying to create a visible army. It was trying to weave a thread of risk into the comfortable routes rats had woven for themselves. What followed wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, incremental, and unmistakable, the kind of shift you only notice when the old patterns begin to break. The slow unraveling of rat confidence. The first nights after the releases were uneventful by human standards. The creatures explored, tested edges, retreated, and tried again. Their movement showed up as quiet blips on tracking tools, small pulses along the mapped corridors. Nothing dramatic enough for a movie. Nothing spectacular enough for a news drone. But the rats felt it. In sections of the city that had been effectively unchallenged for years, new scents appeared. Routes that had been safe shortcuts now carried the signature of pursuit. Burrow entrances, once used without caution, were approached with hesitation or abandoned entirely. Rats shifted their movements deeper, into cracks, moving later at night, hugging tighter to walls, cutting their foraging times. From the perspective of a warehouse manager, this first showed up as a small change in where droppings appeared, or did not appear. From the perspective of a school custodian, it meant that the same trap that always caught something suddenly sat empty for days. For a line worker, it meant that the same vulnerable junction stopped failing as often. At first, people wondered if they were just getting lucky. Luck does not redraw maps. The patterns did. Over the next seasons, monitoring teams saw daytime sightings in certain districts fall sharply. Rats, forced to become more cautious, retreated from high-risk zones that overlapped heavily with human food systems. They still existed. They still moved. But they did so in ways that posed far less threat to public health and infrastructure. Rather than trying to erase rats from the equation completely, the city had tilted the board. The creatures did not have to be seen to do their work. The silence they left in their wake was evidence enough. The data that spoke louder than the jokes. City projects can live or die by narrative, but this one survived by numbers. The people running it knew that anecdotes would not convince skeptics. They also knew that the internet's appetite for mockery did not leave much room for nuance. So they watched the metrics with almost obsessive focus. Sanitation departments logged calls about infestations and tracked changes by neighborhood. Health inspectors recorded violations related to rodent activity and watched the trends over time. Utility companies fed bite-related outage data into city dashboards. Pest control vendors shared anonymized reports on trap success and hotspot movement. School districts tracked cafeteria closures and complaints from staff. Piece by piece, a new picture emerged. In districts where the creatures were most established and the habitat design was most complete, rat complaints declined. Not vanished, not magically erased, but measurably reduced in ways that persisted across seasons. Outages tied to gnaw damage became less frequent. Food waste facilities that once battled constant incursions reported stretches of time that felt eerily calm. Skeptics pointed to other factors, and some of those factors certainly played a role. Education campaigns had encouraged residents to secure bins more tightly. Some businesses had improved building maintenance independently, but when analysts compared the data across multiple areas, the same pattern kept surfacing. Places where the ecological intervention and the human behavior changes aligned showed the strongest, most durable results. It was not a single magic trick, it was a system. The headline that made everyone laugh had reduced the story to a single absurd detail. The truth sprawled across maintenance logs, outage summaries, inspection forms, and budget lines. But numbers alone couldn't quiet every fear. With success came new questions, and the city would have to answer them honestly. The fear of new problems, and the reality of trade-offs. No experiment in a living city comes without worry. People asked what would happen if the creatures multiplied beyond control. They asked whether they would turn on pets or become a new nuisance. Others worried about impacts on birds, reptiles, and existing small mammals. Some objected simply because the whole thing sounded like a risk they had not consented to, and that feeling was not entirely unreasonable. The project team responded by building safeguards into the design from the beginning. The choice of species mattered. Mustelids with strong territorial instincts self-limit their density. When population pressure rises too high in one space, younger animals disperse along the available corridors instead of piling into a single area. The mapped habitat network ensured that dispersal happened in predictable directions and avoided critical conservation areas. Monitoring remained constant. Camera traps, scat analysis, and observational reports helped teams understand where densities rose too quickly or where animals were pressing against unintended boundaries, such as parks heavily used by small children. In those cases, adjustments were made. Habitat features might be shifted, food availability subtly reduced, or new access paths opened elsewhere to draw movement away from sensitive zones. Conflicts with pets did not vanish entirely, but they remained rare and manageable. The creatures were wary of large animals and human presence, conditioned that way from the start. Most residents never saw them. When sightings did happen, they tended to be quick glimpses at dusk, the kind of, "Did you see that?" moments that sparked curiosity more than fear. The city did not pretend there were no trade-offs. Instead, it treated those trade-offs as the price of doing better than the previous status quo, which had been trading poisoned predators, degraded soil, and constant infrastructure damage for a sense of control that was never real. And in the months that followed, improvement began revealing itself, not in headlines, but in the smallest moments of daily life. Ordinary scenes that quietly announced success. If you had asked people to picture what success would look like at the beginning, many would have imagined dramatic footage. Maybe a time-lapse of rats disappearing from a street. Maybe some triumphant visual of predators patrolling rooftops like something out of a movie. The reality was much more mundane and far more meaningful. On a side street behind a neighborhood bakery, the owner realized one afternoon that the broom he had kept by the back door, just in case, had not been used in weeks. He had kept it there for years, banging it against bins to scare away movement before stepping outside. Now, there was nothing to scare off. At an elementary school, a custodian finally erased a note on a whiteboard that had been there for so long it had become invisible. Check planter boxes at lunch. The planters that once hid burrows were just planters again. Children tended herbs and flowers without anyone worrying about what might dash out. At a small apartment complex, tenants noticed that the late-night sounds in the walls had gone from scratching to nothing at all. The building still creaked, the pipes still hummed, but the particular set of noises that made skin crawl were gone. The property manager kept waiting for the next round of complaints that never came. These were tiny victories. None of them would trend. Yet each one represented hours of labor, months of planning, and years of living with a problem that finally seemed to be receding. Success did not feel like a parade. It felt like the deep, slow exhale of a city that had been holding its breath for too long. That exhale didn't happen on its own. Behind it were people whose work rarely made noise, yet shaped everything. The people who held the system together. Behind every dot on a map, every data point, and every quiet alley were people whose names most residents would never know. Biologists spent nights watching grainy footage without sound, tracking the way a single creature chose a route. Engineers climbed onto roofs in the hottest months to check whether small habitat patches were holding moisture the way they were supposed to. Landscapers learned new pruning patterns that favored cover for the allies hiding inside the city's greenery. Sanitation supervisors reworked pickup schedules, not because someone told them to, but because the data showed that an earlier or later route in a certain alley made the entire ecological strategy more effective. Teachers at some schools wove the project into science lessons, helping students understand that their choices about litter and food waste were connected to a larger experiment playing out around them. Community organizers helped translate technical updates into plain language for neighborhood meetings. They explained why a certain kind of lid mattered, why propping the bin for a moment could undo hours of careful work, and how their own streets were part of something much larger than a single pilot program. The creatures were an essential piece, but the humans were the hinge. Without them, the project would have been a stunt. With them, it became a living system that could adapt, repair itself, and endure questions without collapsing. No system runs smoothly forever. Soon, nature and the city would push back. Setbacks, repairs, and the art of not quitting. There were bad weeks. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Storms hit harder than forecast and flooded corridors that had seemed secure. Heat waves lasted longer than models had predicted, stressing both the creatures and their prey base. A single poorly planned event left trash piled at odd times, inviting rats to surge back into areas that had been stable for months. Each setback came with a temptation: abandon the experiment and return to something that looked simpler on a spreadsheet, even if it cost more in hidden ways. Instead, the teams leaned into what they had learned. They reinforced structures, adjusted plantings, and refined outreach. They moved quickly when a pattern started to tilt the wrong way. They accepted that living systems do not respond kindly to rigid expectations. Resilience, they discovered, was not a feature you bolt on at the end. It was a discipline you practice in the middle, when the data looks messy and the pressure is high. The creatures kept moving. The rats kept recalibrating. So did the people. Then, slowly, the chaos gave way to something the city hadn't heard in years. Quiet that signaled balance, not neglect. The silence that finally meant something good. For a long time, silence in certain parts of the city had meant neglect. An alley that stayed quiet was an alley no one bothered to complain about anymore. A building where people stopped calling about scratching was sometimes a building where they had simply given up. Now, silence carried a different weight. When a cluster of blocks went weeks without a single rat-related service request, it did not mean people had stopped talking. It meant they finally had nothing to talk about on that front. When inspectors walked through kitchens and back rooms and found no fresh signs of gnawing, the quiet felt earned, not imposed. When an entire summer passed without a single rat-linked outage in a neighborhood that used to endure several, people described it not as luck, but as finally normal. Normal is underrated until you lose it. Los Angeles had not transformed itself into a pristine, untouched utopia. It had done something harder. It had taken a messy living problem and woven it into a new pattern where risk was managed, not ignored, and where nature was an ally, not just a threat to be neutralized. The silence in its alleys and behind its walls was not empty. It was full of work that had been done well. And as the noise faded, so did the memory of the joke. The city had changed, and so had the narrative. The city that stopped caring about the joke. In the end, the internet moved on. It always does. New headlines appeared, new targets emerged, new memes replaced the old. Somewhere in the flood of everything, the story of the rat-killing creatures became a footnote, a relic of a week when people needed something to laugh at. Los Angeles did not have that luxury. It had to live with the consequences of what it tried. What it found slowly was that the joke did not matter. What mattered was the relief on the face of a restaurant owner who no longer started the day with dread. The absence of worry in parents whose children played near school gardens that no longer hid burrows. The confidence of workers who knew that the next storm was less likely to snap a line because something had been chewing it silently for weeks. The truth was, never a punchline. It was a city choosing design over cynicism, ecology over brute force, and patience over panic. People laughed at Los Angeles for releasing thousands of rat-killing creatures. But the real story is that the city stopped fighting nature and asked it to help instead. Now the question is simple. Could your city do the same? Comment below with one thing you'd fix first where you live. And if you want more stories about bold ideas quietly reshaping the places we call home, tap subscribe and give this a like so others find it too.